I'll draw my big Tracy Snub Nose 38, and I'll...
Start your good breakfast with Kellogg's Sugar Frosted Flakes cereal.
He would have stopped all smoking on short flights like this one.
Remember the funniest things from the 70s? The ones we all loved but somehow aren't allowed anymore? These things filled our homes, schools, and screens with laughs, danger, and a kind of freedom that felt totally normal back then. When did what made us laugh start getting locked away? You ever hold a piece of chalky sugar between your fingers and pretend to blow out smoke like a Hollywood star? That was childhood in the 1970s. Candy cigarettes were the ultimate playground status symbol. You'd walk around with a red-tipped sugar stick hanging from your lips, squinting like Clint Eastwood, thinking you looked 10 times cooler than you were. Nobody blinked twice. Parents bought them right alongside bubblegum and jawbreakers. Back then, it was all about the fun, not the future. What was a little pretend puff compared to a real Marlboro? Except, it was not just pretend. Candy cigarettes made smoking look fun, normal even, and it worked. Studies later showed kids who played with them were more likely to smoke for real later. Oops. Eventually, health experts and angry moms caught on. Companies either pulled them from shelves or gave them harmless rebrands like candy sticks. But let's be real. Nobody was fooled. That little red dye at the end still screamed, "I'm gonna grow up to smoke." So now, they are banned in many states, hidden away like a relic of reckless innocence. Which is kind of wild when you think about it. Imagine giving a 10-year-old a play beer or fake vape today and calling it cute. Different times. If you never hurled a heavy metal dart across the yard and narrowly missed your cousin's head, did you even grow up in the 1970s? Jarts, or lawn darts, were sold as outdoor family fun. Just a good old-fashioned game of aim and toss, like horseshoes, but with actual spears. These things were massive, made of thick plastic and metal tips that could pierce the ground, and occasionally, people. Yet they came in bright colors and family-friendly boxes like a wholesome backyard treat. Nobody thought twice about handing kids a pointed missile and saying, "Go play." It felt like summer. Toss a dart, grill a hot dog, try not to bleed. But by the late 1980s, things took a turn. Emergency rooms started seeing more injuries, then a few deaths, the kind no amount of marketing spin could fix. Parents began asking why a kid's toy needed to double as a weapon. The government responded by banning Jarts for sale and import. Manufacturers tried to argue. They made safe versions with blunter ends, but by then the damage was done. Jarts were done too. These days, they are collector's items, which is funny when you think about how many are probably still buried behind people's garages. A product once sold as a game now reads more like a cautionary tale. And yet, deep down, part of you misses that wild freedom, even if it came with a risk of stitches. You know what really sells a pack of smokes? A man in a white coat saying it is good for your health. Back in the 1970s, television was full of cigarette ads where real doctors, yes, actual licensed professionals, told you which brand was smoother on the throat or less irritating. These were not actors pretending to care. These were the same folks who gave you shots and told you to eat more greens. And now, they were endorsing tobacco. It sounds completely unhinged now, but it was dead serious then. Cigarette companies ran with it. Some of the most iconic ads had doctors saying they smoked Camels, not just off camera, but while making house calls. You would watch this on your living room set while Dad puffed away in his recliner, nodding like it all made sense. The trust was automatic. If your doctor smoked, how bad could it be? But the truth was catching up. As lung cancer numbers climbed, the facade cracked. By the end of the 1970s, public outrage and mounting health evidence forced networks to pull cigarette commercials completely. The white coats disappeared, the Camel men vanished, and those reassuring voices were replaced by Surgeon General warnings. Still, for a moment in time, a doctor's words sold addiction by the carton. Now it just feels surreal, like an alternate universe we barely escaped. Ever tried to breathe in a flying ashtray at 30,000 feet? That was airline travel in the 1970s. No matter how sleek the uniforms were or how glamorous the idea of flying sounded, The air in those cabins was thick with smoke. Literally. You could not escape it. Rows had ashtrays in every armrest. The smoking section was a joke because the entire plane reeked. Light up in row 12, and the guy in row 30 would still get a lungful. It was just part of the experience. You dressed up, boarded the plane, and puffed your way through turbulence. Flight attendants even offered free cigarettes during some flights. They called it service. Nobody seemed to care that there were babies on board or people with asthma just trying to survive a cross-country trip. But the lawsuits and the science were coming. By the mid-1980s, airlines began sectioning off smoking zones. Eventually, full smoking bans rolled in for domestic flights, then international. It took a while, but now it is unthinkable. The idea of someone lighting up next to your aisle seat is enough to cause a full-blown panic. It is a health violation, a fire hazard, and just gross. But back then, it was the sky-high version of a lounge, and every ticket came with a side of secondhand smoke. Nothing says family entertainment like a full-grown host kissing strangers on national television. In the 1970s, game shows were filled with winks, nudges, and smooches, usually from the host to whatever contestant happened to be female. The king of this gimmick was Richard Dawson on Family Feud. He kissed every woman who stepped up to the podium. Married, single, old, young, did not matter. Lip to lip, cheek to cheek, it was his signature move. Studio audiences cheered. Contestants blushed. Nobody called it weird. Not then. It was seen as charming, maybe even classy. But imagine that happening today. Cue the lawsuits. It was a time before workplace boundaries had a name, before anyone talked about consent on air. Hosts were celebrities, and contestants were expected to go along with whatever the format threw at them. Whether it was kissing, hugging, or leering jokes, it was just how TV worked. Eventually, it stopped working. People started speaking up. Networks got cautious. The idea of a host kissing random people now would spark outrage, not applause. But for a while, that was primetime gold. And looking back, it is a weird mix of hilarious and horrifying. Before car seats, before safety laws, before anyone thought about windburn or flying gravel, there was the back of the pickup truck. In the 1970s, this was every kid's favorite spot. No seatbelts, no helmets, just a steel bed and the open road. You would pile in with your cousins, sit on a tire or toolbox, and hang on for dear life. It was like a roller coaster, but free. You could wave at cars behind you, shout into the wind, or lie down and watch the clouds zoom by. It felt like freedom. But freedom has a price. Accidents happened, kids flew out during sudden turns or breaks, hospitals took note, so did lawmakers. By the 1990s, most states banned kids from riding in the back of trucks. A few still allow it in rural areas, but the carefree rides of the past are mostly gone. These days, you would get pulled over in minutes. Back then, it was just another Sunday drive. Looking back, it is hard to believe it was ever allowed, but it is also hard not to smile at the memory. 2 hard plastic balls on a string. What could go wrong? In the 1970s, clackers were the height of schoolyard cool. You held the little ring, swung the balls up and down until they clacked together above and below your hand. Clack, 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 like some kind of hypnotic chaos machine. Everyone had a pair, until they exploded. Literally. Clackers were made from acrylic so brittle it shattered under stress. If you got good at them, and people did, the friction would heat the plastic and eventually, bang! A ball would snap and send sharp plastic flying like shrapnel. Kids ended up with bruises, cuts, and in rare cases, glassy bits in the eye. Parents freaked out. Teachers banned them from schools. Eventually, so did the government. Clackers were pulled from toy shelves. A safer version came later, but the fun was over. The danger was part of the thrill. They were banned for being too awesome and too violent. And you know what? That kind of sums up a lot of 1970s toys. Imagine walking into a bowling alley or laundromat, slipping in some change, and out pops a pack of smokes or a cold can of beer. That was life in the 1970s. Vending machines for cigarettes and alcohol were everywhere. No ID check, no age limit, just coins and convenience. Kids could and did buy packs of cigarettes right next to a Snickers bar. Nobody asked questions. It was just normal. Bars had them. Gas stations had them. Even some workplaces had them in break rooms. You needed a smoke on your lunch break? Hit the vending machine. No manager required. It was a freedom people took for granted. But the consequences piled up. Underage smoking soared. Teens were sneaking beer from machines. Eventually, lawmakers stepped in. Restrictions got tighter. Machines vanished. Some places still have cigarette vending machines, but only in tightly controlled spots with ID scanners. And beer? Forget it. The machines are long gone. But for a while, they were the ultimate symbol of adult convenience and total oversight failure. Back in the 1970s, a Babysitter's starter pack looked a lot different. You had a bottle of soda, a six-pack of beer in the fridge, and a cigarette in one hand. And this was for the sitter, not the parents. Teenagers were regularly left in charge of kids with zero supervision and full access to whatever was in the kitchen, or the liquor cabinet. You could find 15-year-olds lighting up after putting toddlers to bed. Some even had the nerve to invite friends over for an impromptu hangout. It sounds like a setup for a bad sitcom, but it was real. Parents trusted young teens without background checks, cell phones, or emergency numbers. Just a quick wave and a "call us if the house burns down." No one blinked. The kids survived, somehow, and so did the homes. But over time, people got smarter. Safety laws tightened. The drinking age was enforced. Babysitters stopped being party hosts and became actual caregivers. Smoking around children? Banned. Drinking while watching kids? Illegal in many places. But back then, it was just Tuesday night. You have not lived until you have ridden in the back of a station wagon facing traffic. In the 1970s, that was the dream seat. The backward-facing bench. No seatbelts. Just a metal handle to grab when the car turned too fast. It was like being on a slow-moving carnival ride. You waved at drivers, made faces at strangers, watched headlights come at you like a chase scene from a spy movie. Parents loved it too, because you were out of sight and, more importantly, out of the way. Nobody worried about crash safety or whiplash. It was just how cars were built. Safety regulations were not what they are today. Back then, fun mattered more than physics. But as car accidents rose and data poured in, change was inevitable. Laws were passed. Seatbelts became mandatory. Rear-facing seats in cars disappeared. Now it is booster seats, airbags, and child locks. But for a moment in time, kids rode in the past, literally, and thought it was the future. Saturday morning was sacred. You woke up, turned on the television, and there they were, bright, loud, animated mascots peddling mountains of sugar with wide eyes and wacky voices. Tony the Tiger told you it was great. Toucan Sam begged you to follow your nose. These were not just cartoon animals. They were advertisers in disguise. The 1970s saw the golden age of kids programming and an explosion of cereal commercials during those very hours. It was targeted marketing at its sharpest. Kids glued to cartoons were bombarded with jingles, mascots, and colorful boxes offering a toy inside and 40 grams of sugar per bowl. Parents thought it was harmless, but nutritionists raised alarms. So did regulators. Turns out cartoon animals convincing 5-year-olds to eat dessert for breakfast every day was maybe not the healthiest plan. Today, there are strict rules about advertising to children. Some countries ban it entirely, and most networks voluntarily restrict sugary cereal ads during kids' programming blocks. The mascots still exist, but they have been declawed. Less aggressive, more balanced. Now they push whole grain and fortified with vitamins. But back then, it was a cartoon sugar war, and every kid picked a side. In the 1970s, classrooms came with rulers, chalkboards, and something else: paddles. Big, flat wooden paddles, often with holes drilled in for aerodynamics, hung behind teacher desks like a warning sign. If you acted out, bend over and brace yourself. Corporal punishment was not a threat. It was standard policy. A smack on the rear was seen as discipline, not abuse. Some schools even had paddling ceremonies where misbehaving kids were punished in front of their classmates. Principals took pride in how hard they could swing. Parents supported it. Spare the rod, spoil the child was not just a saying, it was parenting 101. Kids lived in fear of that paddle, and some even claimed teachers had favorites when it came to who got the worst of it. Over time, medical professionals and child psychologists began to speak up. Turns out, hitting kids with boards does not exactly promote a healthy learning environment. By the late 1980s, most states had banned corporal punishment in public schools, but some states still technically allow it to this day. That said, the era of the disciplinary paddle is mostly gone. What used to be routine now feels like a horror story. But in the 1970s, that paddle was part of the curriculum. If you were drunk and slurring in the 1970s, chances are you had a hit sitcom deal. Comedy shows back then loved their lovable lush. Characters like Foster Brooks or Dean Martin's television persona stumbled, hiccuped, and winked their way through variety shows and primetime programs. It was always the same gag. The guy who had one too many leaned on the mic stand and forgot his lines. The crowd roared, the laugh track kicked in. America chuckled and poured another drink. Alcoholism was not treated like a disease, it was a punchline. Even kids watching with their families saw it as normal. Uncle Bob acts funny after dinner, just like the guy on TV. But the reality underneath was less hilarious. Behind the scenes, many of these performers struggled with real addiction, and audiences began to notice. As public awareness grew around alcohol abuse and its consequences, the tide turned. Networks pulled back, characters stopped slurring, the drunk gag faded out. Today, shows still depict alcohol, but not like that, not as a constant joke. The image of the jolly drunk stumbling across the screen has been quietly retired, but for a decade or more, he was the life of the party, and no one asked if he needed help. In the 1970s, your living room might have looked more like a bouncy castle. Blow-up furniture was all the rage. Inflatable chairs, inflatable sofas, even inflatable ottomans. They came in bright neon colors and were made of shiny PVC plastic. You bought them at department stores and blew them up by mouth or with a little pump. They were light, cheap, and supposedly cool. If you were a teenager or college student, having a blow-up chair meant you were with it. Problem was, the stuff was barely furniture. Sit on it too fast and it would burst. Drag it across the floor and it might tear. Leave it in the sun and it melted into a chemical-smelling blob. But worse than any of that? The fumes. PVC off-gassing was not exactly healthy. Inhaling plastic vapor in a closed room for hours? Not ideal. By the 1980s, health concerns and sheer practicality killed the trend. Dorm rooms deflated, literally. Blow-up furniture became a punchline. Today, the only place you are likely to see inflatable chairs is in novelty shops or ironic TikTok videos. But back then, this was peak Gen X style. Comfort was optional. Trendiness was everything. The 1970s were the Wild West of toy advertising, and nothing captured that better than kids on TV blasting away with ultra-realistic plastic rifles. These were not Nerf guns or neon-colored water pistols. These were replicas, down to the grain of the wood stock and the sound of the clicking chamber. Some even had fake shells that ejected. Kids dressed in camo, aiming down sights, running across fields like little soldiers. Parents watched the commercials and smiled. Boys will be boys. Nobody thought about the real consequences, until they did. Stories began circulating, police mistaking toy guns for real ones, kids injured or worse. Schools started banning them, cities followed. By the 1990s, new rules required toy guns to have bright orange tips. Some states banned certain designs entirely. Today, most toy weapons are stylized beyond recognition. But if you lived through the 1970s, you remember the power you felt with that rifle in your hand until you realized how close it came to being something else entirely. There was a time when the word retarded was everywhere. In sitcoms, in stand-up, in classrooms. It was tossed around as an insult, a joke, or just lazy slang. And people laughed. They barely blinked. In the 1970s, that word was still printed in medical documents and used in school testing. But mostly, it had become a punchline. "You're so retarded" was considered funny. It meant someone was acting silly or dumb. Characters on TV said it without consequence. Teachers said it during lessons. Kids repeated it without knowing what it really meant. But for the people it described, people with intellectual disabilities, it was never just a word. It was a label, a put-down, a barrier. Advocates began speaking up. Organizations like the Special Olympics launched campaigns to change the language. By the 2000s, the term was largely scrubbed from legal and medical use. Public pressure killed it in media. Today, saying that word on television would cause instant backlash. It is considered hate speech by many, and rightly so. But for decades, it was part of everyday speech, a reminder of how language can evolve and how slow that evolution can be. There was a time when Times Square was not for families. It was not for Disney. It was not for tourists with selfie sticks. In the 1970s, Times Square was a neon-lit jungle of vice. Theaters, strip clubs, and most famously, peep shows. You paid a few coins, stepped into a small booth, and watched. What you saw depended on where you went. Some places had live dancers behind glass. Others showed short adult films. It was dark, loud, seedy, and completely normal. Times Square was advertised as gritty, raw, real New York. Tourists came to see it. Locals just accepted it. But underneath the lights, there was danger. Crime surged. Exploitation ran rampant. Eventually, the city stepped in. With major redevelopment efforts in the 1990s, peep shows disappeared, replaced by chain stores and tourist attractions. Today, Times Square is scrubbed clean, bright and family-friendly. But some New Yorkers still remember when it was all flickering signs and whispers behind glass. Flying in the 1970s was considered glamorous, but that glamour came with a price, usually worn by the women serving your drinks. Airline stewardesses, never flight attendants back then, were hired less for their skills and more for their looks. There were height requirements, weight checks, makeup inspections. And those uniforms? Miniskirts, go-go boots, tight blouses. Entire advertising campaigns centered around how attractive your stewardess might be. Airlines sold sex as part of the service. One campaign even said, "Fly me." These women were often required to be single and could be fired if they got married or pregnant. Think about that. Your entire job was dependent on staying young and available. By the end of the 1970s, lawsuits began to pile up. Feminist groups pushed for change. Slowly, the rules faded. Uniforms changed, job titles changed, stewardesses became flight attendants, and the sky was no longer a catwalk. But for years, commercial aviation treated its female staff like fashion accessories, and the passengers just smiled and buckled in. It is hard to imagine now, but in the 1970s, you could still turn on a television and see blackface. On comedy shows, on variety specials, in front of live audiences, white performers would darken their skin, exaggerate their features, and perform racist caricatures. And the audience? They laughed. Sometimes they gave standing ovations. Shows like the Black and White Minstrel Show still aired in parts of the world. Others did versions of it under different names. Even in America, echoes of the minstrel tradition popped up in so-called comedy routines. The impact was real. These skits reinforced stereotypes, normalized mockery, and dehumanized entire communities. But nobody talked about that at the time. To the industry, it was just a sketch. To many viewers, it was tradition. But activists and artists were watching and speaking out. Slowly, the shame caught up. The skits stopped airing. The reruns vanished. Today, blackface is universally condemned, a career ender, a cultural scar. But for too long, it was just showbiz. In sitcoms of the 1970s, threats of domestic violence were a running joke. "One of these days, Alice, Bang, zoom, straight to the moon. It was a line from The Honeymooners, but the sentiment echoed across television. Husbands yelling at wives, raising fists, the audience laughing. It was comedy, they said. Just a bluff. Nobody ever actually got hit. But that was the problem. It made real fear sound like a punchline. It made control look funny. Shows like All in the Family or The Jeffersons had characters yelling, intimidating, or shaming their partners. And the crowd howled. But off-screen, those threats were real for a lot of viewers, and eventually people started to ask, why is this funny? Activists called it out. Writers shifted gears. Networks quietly retired those gags. Today, a joke like that would stop a show cold. But in the 1970s, it got applause. Which makes you wonder, what else were we laughing at that we should not have been? In the 1970s, the classroom was not just a place to learn math and science. It was also sometimes a stage for bad jokes with worse timing. Male teachers, many of them tenured and unchecked, made harmless comments about what their female students wore. Skirt too short? Legs crossed too slowly? It became the setup for a punchline. Is it windy in here or just your outfit? Got laughs from the front of the room. The girls, meanwhile, sat frozen, embarrassed, uncertain whether to laugh along or shrink into their desks. And the boys? They laughed too. After all, if the teacher said it, it must be fine. That kind of classroom culture created a silent, ongoing discomfort for girls trying to focus on their education. And nobody did anything about it. There was no HR in public school, no anonymous hotline, just a heavy silence that followed the bell. Eventually, more women entered the education field. Feminist movements gained steam, and those jokes started sounding a lot more like what they were: harassment. Today, teachers making personal comments about students' bodies would be fired, or worse. But back then, it was chalked up to charm. A funny guy with tenure. And every young girl who walked into his classroom knew exactly what kind of attention she would get, and that nobody was going to stop it. Long before brand makeovers and social media apologies, there were logos on cereal boxes, baseball jerseys, and school gym walls, featuring cartoon versions of Native Americans. Smiling, waving, feather-wearing caricatures meant to be cute or bold. The 1970s were full of them. Teams like the Cleveland Indians, the Washington Redskins, and countless high schools used these images as mascots. Kids dressed up in war paint at pep rallies. Fans did mock chants from the bleachers. The imagery was so common, most people stopped seeing it. Or worse, they thought it was honoring native culture. But it was not. It was simplification, stereotyping, a constant visual reminder of how indigenous identities had been flattened into costume and mascot form. Native groups protested, but they were often ignored. It's tradition, people said. It's just a logo. But for the people being depicted, it was not just ink on a helmet. It was erasure. Over time, pressure grew. Universities dropped their mascots. Then pro teams followed. Today, most schools and sports franchises have moved away from using Native American imagery, though not without resistance. Some still cling to it, calling it heritage. But ask the communities being represented, and you will hear another word: disrespect. The funny thing is, a lot of people did not even realize it was offensive because they never had to think about it. And that is exactly why it stayed around as long as it did. You probably never saw it. That is the scary part. Asbestos was everywhere in the 1970s, tucked into ceiling tiles, sprayed onto school walls, and mixed into the fluffy pink insulation stuffed behind the drywall at home. It was marketed as a miracle material, fireproof, durable, cheap. What no one talked about, at least not loudly, was that breathing it in could kill you. Slowly, decades later. Kids sat through math class while microscopic asbestos fibers floated in the air. Janitors swept floors lined with toxic dust. Builders carried it barehanded, all because nobody wanted to admit it was dangerous, or they did not know, or they knew and did not care. In the 1970s, asbestos was still legal and widely used. Only a handful of studies were public. Whistleblowers were silenced, and everyday Americans kept living, learning, and sleeping under roofs lined with poison. Eventually, lawsuits brought the truth out. The links to mesothelioma and other cancers became undeniable. Governments responded, slowly, with regulations, inspections, and removals. But millions had already been exposed. Today, schools undergo asbestos abatement. Homeowners pay thousands to remove it. But back then, it was just another layer in the walls. The worst part is that it was invisible. You did not see the danger. You just breathed it in. In the 1970s, kids put everything in their mouths: blocks, toys, railings, and that was a real problem because so much of it was painted with lead. Lead-based paint was bright, cheap, and easy to apply. It made red redder, yellow pop, and blue shine like a summer sky. Nobody questioned what was inside it. Not at first, so you had swing sets painted with it, wooden toy trains, even lunch boxes. And yes, toddlers chewed on them. That is what toddlers do. Unfortunately, lead does not just stay on surfaces. It chips, flakes, and rubs off into mouths, into bloodstreams, into developing brains. Kids started showing signs of lead poisoning, developmental delays, behavior problems, and lifelong cognitive damage. And still, for years, no one connected the dots. Or they did, and just moved slowly. In 1978, the United States government finally banned lead-based paint in homes and on children's products. But by then, it had already done its damage. Generations of children were exposed to a neurotoxin because no one had bothered to ask if paint should be edible. Today, lead paint is a warning sign, a lawsuit, a public health crisis. But once, it was just color, a little extra shine on a toy truck, and a quiet poison hiding in plain sight. In the 1970s, if you wanted to lose weight fast, there was a pill for that, maybe several. Diet products were everywhere, marketed to housewives, working women, even teenagers. These pills promised energy, appetite control, and rapid results. What they did not advertise was what was inside: amphetamines. Basically, legal speed. You would pop a pill in the morning and feel unstoppable. No hunger, no fatigue, maybe a little jittery, but hey, that just meant it was working. Doctors even prescribed them. Commercials made it sound normal. Just another part of self-care. Magazines were filled with ads saying things like, "Drop 10 pounds by next week," without mentioning the heart palpitations or potential addiction. Side effects? Nervousness, mood swings, insomnia. Sometimes worse. But the obsession with thinness was stronger than the warnings. Women wrote in testimonials about how these pills changed their lives. And maybe they did, for a while, until the crash came, or the dependency, or the ban. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the truth caught up. Amphetamines were reclassified. Weight loss pills were reformulated. But the damage lingered, not just in bodies, but in expectations. Even now, diet culture echoes those days. Quick fixes, instant results, whatever it takes. We just dress it up better now. Scratch and sniff stickers made notebooks smell like fruit salad or something pretending to be. Grape, banana, pizza, popcorn. If it existed, there was probably a sticker that gave off a chemical approximation of it. These tiny scented rewards were currency on the playground. You earned them from teachers. You traded them with friends. You collected them in sticker books and flipped through your favorites like a sommelier of glue and artificial scent. Some smelled better than others. Some were so strong they made your eyes water. Others lost their smell after a few scratches but were kept anyway, honored like faded trophies. You knew the popular ones: root beer, bubble gum, and anything with glitter. You also knew the duds, like liverwurst or mystery meat, that somehow ended up in your binder anyway. Scratching a sticker in class was a quiet act of rebellion. You were not supposed to, but you did. And then you passed the notebook around so others could sniff and nod in approval, or gag in horror. Scratch and sniff stickers were low-tech fun with high nostalgic value. They turned paper into treasure. And even today, one whiff of fake strawberry is enough to transport you straight back to 3rd grade with a smile. It sounded like mariachi horns over a guitar solo. It felt like a backyard cookout mixed with a garage concert. Chicano rock was not just music, it was resistance, pride, a celebration. Born from Mexican-American communities and stitched together with rhythm, blues, Latin beats, and American rock, this genre gave voice to generations caught between cultures. It was the soundtrack of identity, of straddling two worlds and singing from both. Bands like El Chicano and Tierra turned that tightrope walk into an anthem, melodies that carried history in every chord, and they played with heart, soul, grit. You could hear the roots in every note and still dance to it with a plate of rice and beans in your hand. The funny part is how invisible it was to the mainstream for so long, how something so vibrant, so loud could be so overlooked. But if you were part of the community, it was everywhere. At parties, on radios, echoing from lowriders cruising the boulevard. Chicano rock did not just blend genres, it blended generations. It told stories no one else was telling. And it proved that music, like identity, could be layered, complicated, and absolutely electrifying. High Karate aftershave was a joke and a phenomenon all at once. It came in a cheap bottle with a commercial that turned masculinity into a parody of itself. Spray this on, and women would attack you. Literally. The ads were absurd, over the top, and completely unforgettable. But behind the humor was a surprisingly decent scent. High Karate became the go-to for teenage boys trying to smell grown-up and grown men trying to stay playful. It was the cologne you found in your dad's drawer next to the tie clips and old movie stubs. But the joke wore thin. Trends shifted. The 1980s wanted power and polish, not camp and chaos. High Karate was quietly discontinued. Stores stopped stocking it. The bottles became rare. Today, it is a punchline for some and a scent memory for others. A whiff of what it meant to be young, to be bold, to believe that a fragrance could change everything. Mixtapes were handwritten love letters wrapped in cassette cases. You waited by the radio for hours just to hit record at the perfect moment, trying to catch the start of your favorite song without the DJ talking over it. You rewound, replayed, and carefully curated the perfect order so each track melted into the next. Some were made for crushes, others for best friends. Some were sorry tapes, and some were just because. Each one had a theme, a purpose, and a heart behind it. You picked songs that said what you could not. Then you labeled the tape in your best handwriting, maybe decorated the case, and handed it over like it was treasure. Because it was. A great mixtape took hours, sometimes days, to get just right. And when someone gave you one, you listened to it until the tape wore thin and the sound warped. Mixtapes were not just music. They were memories, feelings, time capsules wrapped in magnetic ribbon. And long after the songs faded, you remembered the person who made it, their handwriting, their choices, their message. Even now, in a world of playlists, nothing hits quite like the soft click of a tape deck and a song you once recorded just for someone else. Show and tell felt like technology from another planet, and if you were a kid in the 1970s, it basically was. A boxy contraption with the soul of a film projector and the heart of a storybook, it let you do something incredible. Watch a movie while listening to a record, all in your very own living room. You didn't need a teacher, you didn't need a classroom, you just needed one of those magical little cartridges, half plastic, half mystery, and the willingness to sit still. It would whir to life with a soft hum, the narrator's voice crackling through the speakers, and as the images scrolled across the tiny screen, it felt like the future. One minute you were listening to fairy tales, and the next you were exploring outer space or solving mysteries with a cartoon detective. It was hands-on. It was immersive. It was mesmerizing. Sure, the film sometimes jammed, and yes, the sound occasionally skipped, but who cared? The show and tell turned dull afternoons into cinematic adventures. It made learning feel like fun before anyone thought to market learning as fun. The funny thing is, it was clunky, primitive. But back then, it was everything. A personal theater, powered by your own tiny hands and imagination. There was a time when TWWA meant elegance. A time when stepping onto a Trans-World Airlines flight was like entering a luxury hotel in the sky. The seats were wide, the service crisp, the logo iconic. From movie stars to newlyweds, everyone wanted to fly TWA. It was part of the golden age of air travel. But by the 1970s, the clouds were darkening. Deregulation hit hard. New competitors raced into the skies, offering faster routes and cheaper fares. Fuel prices soared, labor disputes dragged on, and TWA's once glorious reputation began to buckle. What once felt like flying with royalty now felt outdated and expensive. Suddenly, the airline of tomorrow had become yesterday's news. It expanded too quickly, bought too many jets, and could not keep up with the ruthless economics of modern air travel. Bankruptcy became a familiar word. By the time American Airlines absorbed what remained in the early 2000s, the brand was already a shadow. Airports removed the signs, crews traded uniforms, but the memory lingered. For anyone who flew TWA during its heyday, there was nothing like it. Now, it is a name buried under decades of debt and nostalgia, a ghost with wings. Stirrup Pants were the 1980s attempt to combine fashion with function, and they did neither particularly well. These leggings had a strap that looped under your foot, supposedly to keep them from riding up. In reality, they pulled awkwardly at your ankles, made your feet sweat, and caused socks to bunch in weird places. But we wore them anyway. They came in bright colors, bold patterns, and every synthetic material known to mankind. They were stretchy, shiny, and often paired with oversized sweaters or blazers that made no logical sense. From the knees up, you looked like a school principal. From the knees down, you looked like a gymnast caught mid-warm-up. But Stirrup Pants had their moment. They were the go-to outfit for school picture day, mall trips, or just feeling like you belonged in a fashion catalog. The loop under the foot made you feel oddly secure, like your pants were holding onto you. Sure, they sagged in weird places. Sure, they made your calves look like sausages. But they were a staple, loved, mocked, and deeply missed. For anyone who wore them, Stirrup Pants were more than a fashion choice. They were a commitment, a stretch of spandex, and a rite of passage. It buzzed, it pulsed, it barely made sense. Minimal wave was not made for sing-alongs or car radios. It was made for empty rooms, lit by green fluorescent lights and lonely kids who wanted to feel like machines. Stripped down, bare, cold, and perfect, this was the birth of synth music, and it did not ask for your approval. It just started humming in the background of the late 1970s like a glitch in the system. While disco dominated the airwaves and arena rock-filled stadiums, minimal wave snuck in through the basement. Quiet, awkward, and strangely magnetic. The synthesizers were raw, the drum machines were stiff, and the vocals? Half-spoken, half-sung, all emotion buried under static. But somehow, it worked. It was hypnotic. It was weirdly beautiful in the way a broken radio can be beautiful. And for the misfits, the loners, the kids who did not see themselves in glitter and leather, minimal wave was a new kind of mirror. The funny part is how ahead of its time it was. Nobody knew that in 10 years everyone would be chasing that sound. But if you were there at the beginning, it felt like a secret the future had whispered just to you. Chiaparelli perfumes once lived in the same breathless league as Chanel and Dior. With their surrealist bottles and bold floral compositions, they brought high fashion to the dressing tables of everyday American women. It was not just a scent, it was a statement. In the 1970s, Chiaparelli's legacy still lingered, but America was shifting. Fashion was getting younger, louder, and more synthetic. The brand struggled to adapt. Department stores gave shelf space to trendier, punchier names. The old-world elegance of Chiaparelli felt out of step in a decade of disco and denim. And somewhere along the way, the company let go of its American foothold. Licensing fell apart. Distribution waned. What had once been a symbol of European sophistication became something whispered about in vintage shops. Women who once dabbed it on before dinner parties now found their favorite scents discontinued, forgotten. For some, it was just a bottle, but for others, it was identity. A sense of self wrapped in rose and bergamot, and losing that, quietly, without warning, felt like losing a part of the woman they once were. Leg warmers were a fashion miracle, pointless and perfect all at once. Originally designed for dancers to keep their muscles warm, they jumped out of the studio and into the mainstream thanks to aerobics videos and pop culture icons. Suddenly, everyone was wearing them, over tights, over jeans, even over bare legs. They came in neon, in stripes, in fluffy pastels. Some matched outfits, others clashed proudly. And they served no actual purpose unless you were stretching at a bar or leaping across a dance floor. But no one cared. Leg warmers made you feel like you were part of something glamorous and athletic, even if the closest you got to working out was lifting a hairbrush to lip sync in the mirror. Schools were filled with rows of students rocking scrunched-up fabric around their shins. Some slouched them just above the ankle. Others pulled them high like woolly socks from the future. They were soft, they were cozy, and they were everywhere. Looking back, they might seem silly, but they were fun, expressive, and totally 1980s. And for a few years, they made everyone feel like a star in their own low-budget dance movie. It was the kind of madness only the 1970s could have invented. Strip down, sprint across a public space, and somehow make it feel like a movement. Streaking wasn't just a prank, it was a full-blown cultural phenomenon. And at its peak, it was happening everywhere. College campuses, football fields, live television broadcasts. You'd be mid-sentence or mid-cheer, and boom. Someone zipped by in nothing but sneakers and bravery, trailing shock and giggles in their wake. It wasn't about indecency. It was about absurdity, rebellion, the raw human need to scream, "I exist," in the weirdest way possible. And as strange as it sounds, it brought people together. Total strangers would burst into laughter, point, cheer, and for a second forget everything serious. Forget Nixon, forget bills, forget the fact that dinner was Spam again. Streaking turned the world into a stage, and the performer didn't need a script, just guts. It's funny now how casual it was, how a naked sprint through a graduation ceremony could end in applause. But maybe that was the beauty of it. The 1970s weren't always glamorous, but they were alive. Wildly, ridiculously alive. In the 1970s, Vivitar cameras were everywhere. They were not the fanciest, but they worked. They captured birthday parties, backyard barbecues, and road trips to Mount Rushmore. They were affordable, sturdy, and proudly American. For amateur photographers, Vivitar was a ticket to creativity. But behind the shutters and flashbulbs, the world was changing. Japan was coming fast with brands like Nikon, Canon, and Minolta. Their lenses were sharper, their designs sleeker, and their technology more advanced. Vivitar could not keep up. It tried to pivot, offering accessories, licensing deals, and budget versions of premium cameras. Every shelf they lost in a department store was one less memory they would help capture. They were not just losing market share, they were losing their place in the family album. But the market was ruthless. Film was expensive, competition was brutal, and Vivitar slowly fell out of focus. By the time digital cameras arrived, it was too late. What once filled shelves at Sears and Montgomery Ward now sat in garage sales and thrift stores. Forgotten. But ask anyone who grew up in the 1970s to show you their old photo albums. Odds are, a Vivitar helped make those memories. A camera might just be a tool, but for millions of Americans, Vivitar was how they remembered their lives. Cabbage Patch Kid frenzy turned toy stores into battlegrounds. These soft-bodied dolls with unique, slightly odd faces were the must-have gift of the 1980s. Each one came with a birth certificate and adoption papers, making it feel like you were bringing home a real baby. But getting your hands on one? That was another story. Parents lined up at dawn. Some camped overnight. Others sprinted through department stores in scenes more suited to action movies than holiday shopping. There were arguments, tears, the occasional tackle, and when someone finally scored a doll, they clutched it like it was made of gold. Kids loved them. They named them, dressed them, and carried them everywhere. Some families had to settle for knockoffs with names like Garden Patch Pals that never quite felt the same. But if you had a real one, you were a legend. Looking back, it seems wild that a doll caused so much chaos. But in that moment, nothing mattered more. Cabbage Patch Kids were not just toys. They were trophies. Proof that your parents had braved the crowds and won. And decades later, those round faces still sit on shelves, quietly remembering the madness they caused. That little yellow smile was everywhere, on buttons, bumper stickers, t-shirts, notebooks. It told you to have a nice day, like it actually meant it. And in the weird, wonderful chaos of the 1970s, people needed that message more than ever. The smiley face wasn't just a graphic, it was a lifeline, a gentle rebellion against cynicism, a neon-colored handshake that said, "We're gonna be okay." You'd see it at gas stations, on lunchboxes, on pins stuck to shaggy denim jackets. Even if you didn't believe it, you wanted to. That face was a bright yellow lie we all agreed to live inside. It was corny, it was sincere, it was perfect. It made you feel like someone, somewhere still had hope. And maybe that meant you could too. The funny thing? It worked. That dumb little face made people smile back. In an age of protest, polyester, and disco, the smiley face was the simplest joy. And sometimes, that's all we needed. Clark Equipment Company once helped build America. Its construction vehicles, forklifts, and loaders were staples on job sites across the country. From highways to factories, if something big was being built, Clark was likely there. The brand stood for toughness and reliability. But the 1970s brought headwinds. Inflation climbed, industrial jobs declined, foreign competitors offered cheaper alternatives, and Clark, heavy with overhead and tradition, struggled to pivot. Its innovation slowed, its market share shrank. Machines once seen as symbols of progress started to look like dinosaurs. You could still find them in use, but fewer every year. Workers were laid off. Plants closed. By the 1980s, it was a name people remembered, not one they relied on. Pieces of the company were sold, reorganized, absorbed. What remained was a fragmented legacy. Ask a retired construction worker or a union foreman from the era, and they will nod. They will remember the green machines, the noise, the muscle. Clark Equipment Company did not just lose customers, it lost relevance. And in the business of building, that is the one thing you cannot rebuild. Boombox battles turned sidewalks into stages and backpacks into speaker cabinets. In the 1980s, carrying a massive boombox on your shoulder was more than a way to listen to music. It was a declaration. You had style, you had taste, and you had batteries heavy enough to power a small city block. These machines blasted everything from hip-hop to hair metal, and they did not ask for permission. You walked down the street with your soundtrack trailing behind you, volume all the way up, head nodding to the beat. Some kids parked them at basketball courts. Others lined them up outside corner stores. Whoever had the best bass usually won the crowd. Tapes were traded, dials were turned, and sometimes spontaneous dance-offs broke out right there on the pavement. Boomboxes were heavy, awkward, and impossible to ignore. But in a time before smartphones and Bluetooth, they were portable pride. They made noise. They made statements. And if you saw someone approach with a fresh cassette in hand and a boombox on their shoulder, you knew something good was about to happen. Boombox battles were not just about the music. They were about being seen, heard, and remembered. Burger Chef once had more locations than McDonald's. That is the part people forget. Before the Golden Arches took over every highway exit and downtown corner, Burger Chef was America's fast food sweetheart. Its secret? The Fun Meal, a direct precursor to the Happy Meal. It gave kids toys, games, and branded packaging years before anyone else did. The burgers were solid, the prices were right, and families loved it. But then came the lawsuits, the missteps, the slow bleed of bad business decisions. Hardee's bought them out, closed down locations, and erased the name almost overnight. Some buildings stayed standing for years, sun-faded signs above cracked pavement. You would drive past them and remember the taste, the toy, the tray that made you feel like the meal was yours. What happened to Burger Chef was not just corporate takeover, it was theft by attrition. a slow-motion forgetting of something that once mattered. Ask anyone over 50 if they remember it, and their eyes light up. But there are no new stories being made. No drive-thrus, no jingles, no future, just memories. And that, for a brand that once brought so much joy, feels like a tragedy no one saw coming. They were not just vehicles. They were dreams on wheels, decked out in shag carpet and questionable murals of wizards and wolves. Vansploitation films took the freedom and rebellion of the open road and turned it into cinematic chaos. The plot usually did not matter. A guy, a girl, a van, and a summer full of terrible decisions, that was enough. The Van in 1977 set the tone, a teenage fantasy of cruising, partying, and trying to look cool while living in your car. And people loved it. Because those vans were more than transportation. They were rolling bedrooms, bars, escape pods. They had curtains. They had couches. Some had lava lamps. If you were lucky, yours had an 8-track player and speakers in the back. The funny part is how deeply uncool it looks now. But at the time, it was everything. Independence, adventure, privacy. For a generation raised on rules, the van was a loophole with fuzzy dice on the mirror. Oldsmobile was the brand your grandfather trusted. It was dependable, steady, and proudly American. In the 1970s, it was one of General Motors' most successful lines. The Cutlass was everywhere. Parking lots, driveways, high school graduation gifts. It was a badge of middle-class confidence. But times changed. Japanese automakers brought new efficiency. The luxury market moved to BMW and Mercedes-Benz. And Oldsmobile struggled to define itself. Was it sporty? Was it classic? Was it for young drivers or retirees? The answers never came. Designs grew stale. Performance lagged. The name Oldsmobile started to feel like a joke no one wanted to explain. By the time they rebranded, no one was listening. And the name started to sound old. By the 1990s, Oldsmobile felt like a brand out of time. Sales dropped. Dealers lost faith. General Motors tried to rebrand it, update it, give it a new face. But it was too late. The final Oldsmobile rolled off the line in 2004. For decades, it was the quiet heart of the American road. And then it was gone. Not with a crash, but with a sigh. A slow fade into silence. And if you ever drove one, you remember. The smell of the vinyl seats, the hum of the engine on a long drive. Oldsmobile did not just fail. It retired. Slap bracelets were the toy that hit your wrist and hit peak popularity, almost overnight. They were simple. A metal strip wrapped in colorful fabric that snapped around your arm with one satisfying motion. One moment it was straight, the next it curled tight, clinging to your wrist like a coiled snake. Every kid had one. Some had dozens, trading them like currency during recess. They came in neon colors, animal prints, sparkles, and cartoon characters. The louder the snap, the better. Some kids got so good they could slap them onto their arms without looking. But with popularity came problems. Schools started banning them. Parents worried about the metal underneath. Rumors flew about kids cutting themselves open with a rogue bracelet that had been peeled apart. That only made them cooler. Everyone wanted the forbidden accessory. Teachers tried to confiscate them, but they always found their way back into backpacks and onto arms. Slap bracelets were fun, fast, and a little dangerous, just enough to feel rebellious. They were not just toys. They were fashion statements, fidget tools, and tiny thrills rolled into one. And even now, the sound of that sharp snap is enough to take you right back to 4th grade. Walk through one, and you were instantly transported into another room, another vibe, another world. Beaded door curtains were not just home decor, they were portals. 1 second, you were in the hallway. The next, you were in your older sister's bedroom, where incense was burning and David Bowie was staring from the wall like a glittery prophet. The soft clatter of beads colliding became a soundtrack all its own. And you could never sneak through them, no matter how hard you tried. They were the tattletales of the 1970s, every clink a betrayal, every sway a confession. But they were also beautiful. Cheap, colorful, exotic in a way that felt grown up. You bought them at head shops, flea markets, Or that one aisle in Woolworths that always smelled like patchouli. Whether they were made of bamboo, plastic, or little wooden cylinders painted to look like sunsets, beaded curtains promised something magical beyond them. Something adult, something groovy, and everyone had them, or wanted them. The funny thing is how useless they were at actually dividing rooms or providing privacy. But who cared? In a time when the house was your kingdom and your bedroom was your castle, beaded curtains were your drawbridge. Which one shocked or cracked you up most? Tell us below, like the video, and subscribe for more time travel laughs.